Okay, Professor Rodrigo is, I'm doing this from memory, Rodrigo, so forgive me. Professor Rodrigo is a professor of Islamic studies at Georgetown University. He received his PhD from the University of Chicago, in which he wrote a dissertation on the intellectual genealogy of Ibn Taymiyya, which we're looking forward, we're hoping will will be published soon in some form. And today he's going to talk about, I remembered all of that, but not the actual title. He's going to talk about bad Salafism, Ibn Taymiyya's diagnosis of its origin. Please go ahead, Rodrigo.
Yes, all right. Thank you so much. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, Professor Khan, for your wonderful invitation. And I regret that I cannot be with you in person. Today, I'd like to talk about one of a number of themes which I have isolated in the writings of Ibn Taymiyyah, and I'm glad that there'll be some exchange, some overlap in concepts, and perhaps a refining of our notions. I had a provocative title that I chose for this presentation about bad Salafism, and so I want to talk about what I mean by bad. I think we do have a problem in the study of religion with regard to that category, but I want to talk about it in terms of external views of religion versus internal views of religion, the edict versus the emek. So there is a problem with regards to religious studies in that it tends to be used as a tool for the identification of quote unquote good or bad religion. And this does not necessarily have to be with reference to Islam. It could be with any religion of study in the academy. And this is something that has been written about as a problematic, in that it tends to justify and fund the study of religion institutionally. But there is an unfortunate reduction of religious studies to a division between the good and the bad. And this is an external critique of Salafism, if we were to talk about bad Salafism from that certain perspective, which is known. That is not what I'm talking about today. Rather, I am talking about an emek, an internal critique of a type of Salafism with reference to Ibn Taymiyyah's his own classifications of religious sensibility from a faith commitment. So this is not meant to be an outside academic critique of Salafism, but an inside believer's critique of something called Salafism. So, in other words, a believing Muslim's critique of bad Salafism. So there are types of religious sensibility which are characterized as good and bad depending on one's particular intellectual and faith commitment or non-faith commitment perspective, but this is a Muslim critique. Second point, well, what do I mean by Salafism? If the judgment of good and bad weren't difficult enough, what do I mean by Salafism? And I just like to provocatively, out of jest, share this famous book, which I've never read, but everyone who studies Ibn Taymiyyah that I know has made a reference to it. Ibn Taymiyyah laysa Salafiyan, in the sense that it should make us question the idea that Ibn Taymiyyah is a Salafi or has anything to do with Salafism. This has been debated as the subject of some articles, including by Frank Griffel and others, about whether or not even talking about the word Salafism with reference to Ibn Taymiyyah makes any sense. And that's something that we can talk about certainly afterwards. Maybe instead of asking what's a bad Salafi, we can start with the good Salafi. Ibn Taymiyyah, he invokes this term several times in his works. At-tariqa as-salafiyya, and sometimes it's qualified by an-nabawiyya, al-aqliyya, an-naqliyya. So, although we cannot necessarily translate this into a Salafism ideology of the contemporary world, nor should we, in terms of the appropriateness of doing so, it is important to note how he invokes the Salaf as a type of method, um, as a point of emulation, and it comes with specific qualifiers that are very important for understanding an intervention which Ibn Taymiyyah is trying to make. The Tariqa Salafiyya that Ibn Taymiyyah was advocating for, which was originally the title of my PhD thesis, um, is in fact something more complex than just emulation of the past. And so I'd like us to think about the problems of emulating the past, some of which connect with the Salaf Khalaf idea that we've already seen discussed today in Ibn Taymiyyah's discussion on how the Salaf Khalaf dichotomy is responsible for the bad Salafism, which he will explain. So, not the Tariqa Salafiyya, which he upholds, but a different type of association with the Salaf. So I have laid out some of the genealogy of the Tariqa Salafiyya in terms of Ibn Taymiyyah's most immediate sources. It's not necessarily the topic of my discussion today, but when trying to understand it, there are some conceptual steps which I'd like to lead you through. First and foremost, it involves a critique of kalam. Ibn Taymiyyah's critique of kalam is unironic and unqualified in the sense that from its roots to its conclusions, there have been certain problematic outcomes of the adoption of kalam by Muslim theologians, by Muslim scholars, and in particular Ash'arite kalam. And this has been understood or misunderstood as a type of anti-intellectualism. In reality, Ibn Taymiyyah is trying to save reason from kalam, from the monopoly of kalam. Ibn Taymiyyah would like a different type of reason from kalam, which is why he categorically rejects it in order that something new emerge or be rediscovered to take its place. This, I would argue, should be understood as a type of Sunni self-criticism and not merely a polemic or anti-rationalist attitude, which his writings have been reduced to. This is perhaps also a subject for discussion in the Q&A. Now, this bad Salafism, according to Ibn Taymiyyah, as we will see, it is the product of a critique of how scholastic authority is constructed by Ash'arism, and that there are unintended consequences of how Ash'ari authority is constructed, which leads to what I'm calling holy ignorance as an Islamic value. Now, this is a term taken from a Christian context. The word that he will use is tajheel, and we'll see that. I'll give you that reference in a bit. But what Ibn Taymiyyah is arguing through his, hallmark, very elaborate process of argumentation, which you can agree or disagree with any number one of the premises, but it's a fascinating argument, is that there is a type of bad Salafism that is created by Ash'arism as an unintended consequence of its construction of authority to interpret and of the Islamic past or Salaf which precedes it. So this is the famous Salaf-Khalaf dichotomy. And here what I'll be explaining is what Ibn Taymiyyah would view as the Ash'arite silencing of the Salaf. I want to put this in the terms of Talal Asad, who discusses discursive tradition, religious discursive tradition. There's a reproduction of the past in the present that is done for the future. The present, which Ibn Taymiyyah is looking at, is an orthodoxy which is kalam-based usul ad-din. This present-based practice, which must be perpetuated for the future, in the terms of an orthodoxy maintained by the Khalaf, has been divorced from the Salaf. It speaks in its name, it speaks on the authority of the tradition established by the Salaf, yet Ibn Taymiyyah argues the kalam-based usul ad-din has no space for the Salaf in its actual content. So therefore, there is a type of silencing of the of the Salaf on behalf of the current day practices of the Khalaf that are kalam-based. Now, there's a lot of complexity to Ibn Taymiyyah's discussions of this, critiquing the Ash'arite reproduction of the Islamic past, in that he's pointing to what might be considered a an unintentional but also unavoidable due to the methods of kalam, sort of manufactured obsolescence of traditional creeds. So one way of looking at Ibn Taymiyyah's critique is that the genre of kalam developed and kept on advancing, and people kept writing new books to improve upon or do a better job than their predecessors. And the earlier Salafi or Salaf works of theology or statements of theology were neglected. Not to mention that methodologically, these were not given strength or binding weight in the development of usul ad-din, being restricted to akhbar ahad, and in general, the usul of kalam being prioritized with respect to what is known by reason and not by taqlid or emulation of tradition. So Ibn Taymiyyah would say that the obsolescence of the traditional creeds, which led to them falling out of circulation, was reinforced by their silencing because they did not fall in line with the current practice of kalam, and so needed to be, if you will, silenced in order to not to disrupt that practice. Part of this reconfiguration of the Salaf, with specific reference to God's attributes, is that the knowledge of God's attributes is entrusted to God, tafweed. And what Ibn Taymiyyah argues is that in this statement, theological reasoning is separated from tradition, from the Salaf as sort of foundation, apostolic tradition of Islam. So Ibn Taymiyyah's argument is that the Salaf as ideal type is anti-rational, and that the scholastics of Islam have separated the Salaf from their own methodology, which is reason-based. The Salaf might exist as an ideal type, but that ideal type is separate from the actual practice of the present, which is meant to be perpetuated into the future on a rationalistic basis. And therefore, the Salaf as an emulative role model tends towards the anti-rational. This Taymiyyan critique argues that the Salaf and reason are now formally at odds due to the traditionalist scholasticism of Ash'arism, ironically at odds with itself in how it argues for its authority based on the Salaf, yet has to, for formal reasons, silence the Salaf in order not to contravene its rationalist methodology. Now, I want to give you a paradigmatic example of this critique taken from the Fatwa al-Hamawiyya, in which Ibn Taymiyyah explains the silencing of the Salaf. This was a text which was a response for a fatwa from Hama in northern Syria. There's biographical circumstances I can get into which are interesting. At first, it was very you could say that the Mongol invasion of Damascus in the following year prevented any controversy from developing much further, and that had to wait until after the Mongols left, after which there was a trial in 705, uh, an article about which was written by Sherman Jackson. You can read about it, and he was redeemed. Um, Part of his redemption involved the citation of Salaf texts. Okay, so this was a fascinating example, a practical example, in which he vindicated his position by referencing older texts which were not commonly read at the time. I'm provocatively calling this a Salafi 95 Theses in reference to Martin Luther, because I do think that this text is a founding text of Salafism. I think we can talk about Islamic theology before and after the Fatwa Hamawiyya, even if uh, the delay was the effect was delayed. But in as much as we are caught up with Ibn Taymiyyah, there are certain necessary implications that have to be thought out as a result of it for thinking about Islam today and what Salafism is in the world today. In any case, and I always hate when, Skype covers your screen with this little box. But in the Fatwa Hamawiyya, just to give you the framework, Ibn Taymiyyah wants to resituate Islamic intellectual principles in the past to the Prophet. He explains the Prophet as the utmost explainer, the provider of bayan, and teacher of usul ad-din, ahkam aqliya, being that which is impossible, possible, and necessary for God. All right. That which is impossible, possible, and necessary for God necessarily gets you into ontology, and that which is necessarily known by reason, that which is impossible by reason. Ibn Taymiyyah constructs the Prophet's necessary optim for a communicator of scriptural and rational principles in terms which we can identify from usul al-fiqh, kalam, Sufi, and Abyssinian philosophy. So there is a contingency to his tariqa salafiyya, which we can talk about, though I would advise against viewing it merely as a contradiction. I think he negotiates it in a pretty clever way. And if you want to make sense of it a bit more, I recommend John Hoover's encyclopedia entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy to understand a bit how Ibn Taymiyyah conceives of the rationalism inherent in Islam. In any case, this move by Ibn Taymiyyah is something, I mentioned the Sufi aspect because it's not common for Kalam practitioners to state that the usul have been put in the Prophet's period. The Kalam is usually viewed as a latter-day practice, which was done by necessity, out of a need to defend the religion or to make sense of it and not follow blind authority. We do find certain Sufis like Al-Qushayri and others who make the move to say that the Kalam and Usul are explained in the prophetic generation, and I think that this explains some of Ibn Taymiyyah's view as well. Anyway, leaving that aside, this framework is for him what establishes the premise of a healthy Salafism, okay, in which you have a tariqa Salafiyya aqliya naqliya, in which there is a happy harmony of revelation and rationalism embodied in the Prophet and his early community. Three ideologies go contrary to a good Salafism in the writings of Ibn Taymiyyah, and he mentions this typology in the Fatwa Hamawiyya, and he will repeat it in other works of his. So These ideologies all explain why the Salaf are silent, why the Salaf are not a source of Islamic thought, Islamic theology, or philosophy, and they are contrary to a good Salafism in Ibn Taymiyyah's view. The first is the Ahl Takhyil, the advocates of a Platonic noble lie, who view religion as a means to control the masses. So for them, revelation is inherently fallacious, and the earliest teachings as well, because they're a convenient means to manipulate the feeble-minded. So there's no problem with the Salaf not having knowledge because they are essentially part of the Jumhur as well. The second point of view is the Ahl Ta'wil. In his case, Ibn Taymiyyah's interlocutors from Sunni Kalam. Now, their authority makes the religion transmitted in its substance by the predecessors, the Salaf. However, these predecessors are in ignorance of later usul. As I mentioned before, there's a typical temporal delay in that the Salaf are not the practitioners of it, as that the Prophet was not, but that the usul are a later historical accretion, which are provided by later experts. The third is what I want to talk about today, the Ahl Tajheel. And these are those who they agree with the first two in that the early Salaf had no theology and no rational principles. But in this case, they advocate that as part of their Salafism. They are what Ibn Taymiyyah calls the Ahl Tajheel, and which I'm provocatively translating as advocates of holy ignorance, and that it is justified ignorance. And you can call this a type of fideism. Who are the Ahl Tajheel? Ibn Taymiyyah says, many people associated with the Sunnah and following the Salaf. Now, I think what you can highlight from this is that when I made my earlier remarks about what is Salafism and whether there is a pre-modern Salafism, we do see it mentioned in the sources that so and so would be ala tariqat salaf, or he would make a claim of on his deathbed, testify that I am on the way of the Salaf. My understanding, based off of the rise of the Ash'arite hermeneutic on the Salaf-Khalaf dichotomy and Ibn Taymiyyah's observations on the same, is that when people made the claim to following the Salaf in the 12th and 13th centuries, they essentially were arguing against doing ta'wil and a type of agnosticism concerning the meaning of Scripture with respect to the divine attributes. So this is a position that is advocated by those who want to emulate the Salaf, but it is an emulation of the Salaf that is not naive, but rather mediated by the type of disjuncture created by a Khalaf who worries about the propriety of its practices and requires the Salaf to be a type of pious agnosticism. So Ibn Taymiyyah's critique of the Ahl Tajheel, he mentions that they claim that no one knows the meaning of the verses in Hadith on God's attributes and stop after verse, this is Al-Imran, the 7th verse of Al-Imran, after mention of God, which refers to the Rasikhuna fil ilm. These individuals say that the firmly established in knowledge do not know the interpretation of the mutashabihat. Ibn Taymiyyah says if they fail to know this, then the Prophet would not have been the perfect communicator that he ought to be, and that the revelation would fail in its prescriptions for humanity, that you cannot have an inherently sort of a mystery or verses which are meant to be unknown, especially if they might misguide you. Why would there be tashbih in the Quran if it was going to misguide you? Ibn Taymiyyah thus argues for an anti-fideist position here. This position of stopping after uh, verse 7 of Al Imran uh, had been rejected by practitioners of Ta'wil as well for centuries, but we see with Al-Ghazali and certain Hanbali practitioners of Kalam that this could be justified even from a Kalam-informed position as iljam al-awam an ilm al-kalam, a type of keeping the masses from interpreting scripture in irrational, meaning non-kalam based interpretations, um, and therefore silence in emulation of the Salaf is better for them. Ibn Taymiyyah goes on to critique. Furthermore, these Ahl al-Tajheel, the advocates of holy ignorance, they deny rational matters in these topics completely, al-aqliyat bil-kulliyah, and they do not ascribe to the Prophet and his ummah in regard to knowledge of God either rational or scriptural knowledge, in the sense, not rational knowledge, but also scriptural knowledge in the sense that these verses are a mystery, right? In this way, in their denial of rational knowledge to the Prophet and the Salaf, they resemble the irreligious, the atheists, al-malahida, from many perspectives, and are in error in the ignorance that they ascribe to the Prophet and the Salaf. So Ibn Taymiyyah is fascinatingly saying that an emulation of the Salaf, which believes that the Prophet and the early Muslims had no rational value to their teachings, is very close to atheism and what an irreligious perspective would maintain. And I think that not only does this reveal something of his critique of the Salafism of his time, of the wish to emulate the Salaf, but it also shows for him the essence of an optimism regarding God's revelation and the value of reason as a God-endowed faculty. And that in this sense, ignorance and anti-rationalism are a type of impiety, both with respect to God's plan for the world, but also an insult to the Prophet. And I think that this is a very fascinating discussion, again, internal Muslim debate on the value and the construction of the prophetic figures and of past figures in terms of how rationality can be ascribed or denied of said figures based on one's theological presuppositions. Finally, I just want to wrap up here in explaining Ibn Taymiyyah's intervention. Ibn Taymiyyah wishes to undercut the Kalam view that its practice is a necessary later accretion and rather place rationality at Islamic origins. This allows him to save the pious emulation of Salaf from holy ignorance. If rationality is only a later accretion or innovation, then it cannot be ascribed to the Salaf, and ignorance of rationality is better and more holy. This is something he wants to prevent. There are contradictions of Ash'arism that he thinks are worth pointing out with respect to that narrative. There's also a critique of content. He does not wish Ash'arism to be viewed as the end-all of reason, and for Sunnis to be bound to those exclusivist claims with respect to intellectual orthodoxy. That's beyond the point of our current conversation. Next, I think that we should understand Ibn Taymiyyah's writings as an attempt to reintegrate tradition as a source of theology in light of the fact that Kalam had eliminated it so systematically and so thoroughly in its genre of Kalam writing. This can be understood as a type of ressourcement, an attempt to holistically revisit and reintegrate Islamic sources, where Ibn Taymiyyah does so from a broader variety of sources than one might expect within Sunnism and outside of Sunnism, in order to reconstruct Islamic tradition and Islamic rationalism on the basis of that. As Ibn Taymiyyah argues, the failure to integrate the Salaf and a broader notion of tradition only leaves the alternative, a bad Salafism, which views theological reasoning as foreign to Islam and its founding traditions. Thank you very much for your time.